Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
My name is Jaimie and I'm an alcoholic.
Hey, Jaimie.
I want to thank God for the gift and blessing of sobriety today. I want to thank God that Bill and Bob were put in each other's lives, that we were able to enjoy something that they were able to divinely put together for us to enjoy today, something that gives our lives purpose today. Without Alcoholics Anonymous, it's my belief the world would be a much different place. You know, if they think that the jails and the hospitals and the institutions are full right now, if there was no such thing as AA, it'd be a whole lot worse. It is an honor and a privilege to share in an AA meeting. It's not my favorite thing to do. I'd be more than happy to trade places with somebody here if I could, but I want to thank Josh very, very much for calling me and calling me up and asking me to come and share, you know. Because, before I got to you people, the only thing I was good at was screwing up. It's the only thing I knew how to do, you know. And if you gave me something good, or you gave me a chance, or you gave me an opportunity, it was just a matter of time before I'd screw it up. And I had no skills on how to live life. You know, some people say, well, you know, that they're going to share their opinions when they talk, you know, that it's just their opinion, you know, on what they share. I'm going to try to keep my opinion out of it, you know. I want to try to share my experience and any strength and hope that, you know, that I can share. That's what I want to share, you know. And I was born in the summer of 1967 to Art and Della, my mom and dad. And Art, my dad, was born in Detroit, Michigan, 1930. And when my dad was 6 months old, his dad was killed running moonshine between Chicago and Detroit during Prohibition days. My grandma on my dad's side decided to move the family to Eagle Rock, California, from Detroit, Michigan. Moved to Eagle Rock, and my dad was raised in Eagle Rock. My mom was born and raised in East San Jose, up in Northern California, and she was born to an Al-Anon mom and an alcoholic father. My grandpa on that side was very much an alcoholic. He was a mechanic, a fisherman, a musician, a race car driver, and an alcoholic. That's what he did. And Grandpa English. I had the opportunity to get drunk with Grandpa English one time. That was quite a bit of fun. My grandma left Grandpa English after 44 years of marriage because he couldn't quit drinking. She wanted him to stop drinking, and he tried several times for her. He loved her. He didn't want her to leave, and she eventually left. And of course, after she left him, his drinking definitely went for the worse. You know, he had a very tough time with that. My mom basically grew up in an alcoholic home. You know, I still have my mom today. My dad passed away in June of 1985. My father passed away. My mom and dad basically met each other in Hollywood through a mutual friend of theirs who sold and used heroin. And both my parents were married, had previous marriages before they met each other, and children in those marriages. And my mom was a waitress at a restaurant up in Hollywood in 1964, and my dad come in, and my dad had just gotten out of prison. He was out of prison just shy of a year, and he seen my mom, and he had to have her, you know. And turned out my mom was asking questions about him too, so they ended up getting together. My mom had also done some time in prison because of heroin, and they got together, and you know, they very much loved each other, but you know, this disease was very much alive in that relationship, you know. And it's that kind of love that runs deep, but it runs sick, you know. And that's what they had, you know. They got together in 1964 and got married 1966, and I was born in 1967. And I got a half brother from my mom's side, and a half brother and half sister from my dad's side, and I got a brother 3 years younger than me. Basically what happened was in the early 1970s, my mom and dad were shooting a lot of dope. They were selling dope, shooting dope. In 1969, they were living up in San Jose. They had a deal go bad, and because they both had, you know, prior problems with the state of California, they decided to get out, you know, and so they flipped a coin. I don't know, tails was Vegas or Tahoe, and heads was Vegas or Tahoe. We ended up going to Vegas. On the way to Vegas, my dad passed out in the U-Haul truck, rolled it off in the desert with me and the family cat and all the furniture in it. And you know, when the book talks about a life, you know, that's unmanageable, that was my mom and dad. You know, it was one of those late night moves, and it didn't go good. You know, eventually we made it to Vegas. My dad got a job at the Stardust in the early 70s as a dealer, and about a year after that, my mom was shooting so much heroin that she was shooting up in her big toe, and she wanted to die. She wanted to die. She was on her way to commit suicide, but didn't want to leave my brother and I with dirty diapers, and decided to go to the laundromat and wash the diapers, and then she was going to kill herself that night. And when she was at the laundromat, she noticed a lady at the laundromat that had two kids about the same age as my brother and I, and this lady looked like a normal lady, living life, you know, and something about that lady sparked my mom to change her mind about killing herself, and she decided to get sober. And in Las Vegas, in the early 70s, she started going to AA. And I remember as a kid, you know, my brother and I being drug into these, you know, to these. All I remember about these rooms was, you know, they were very smoky, and there was a lot of old people, and but the people were nice, you know. And as a kid, you know, they'd always offer you, you know, a piece of candy or a jelly donut or something, you know. And you know, I just remember the people were nice there. Unfortunately, my mom you know, she tried to get my dad to clean up, and my dad didn't want it, you know. He hooked up with a showgirl that, you know, was one of the showgirls over at the Stardust, and she wanted to party the way my dad wanted to party, and you know, it hurt my mom a lot, but, you know, he ended up leaving my mom for this lady. And I remember we would drive in my mom's 65 Impala Super Sport over to this lady's house, and my mom would drive this car up on this lady's front lawn and lay on the horn until my dad would come out and give her money for milk and bread and cereal, you know. And they'd be yelling and screaming at each other, you know. He'd come out of the house with no shirt on and his tattoos, and bell bottoms were in then, and he had his bell bottoms on, and, you know, I remember he looked a little rough, you know, and I was about 5 years old, 6 years old, and, you know, and you know, he'd just come out with his hand in his pocket, throwing money in the car, telling her, you know what, get out of here, you know, and she's calling him names, you know, and then the other lady would come to the doorway, and my mom would tell her, why don't you step out, you know, and my mom was literally calling this lady out, you know, and you know, it was bad. Got real ugly, you know. And my brother and I had to see our mom and dad fight pretty bad between each other. And my mom couldn't handle it no more, and she wanted to come back to California. And my parents had lived in Venice in the mid '60s. Actually, when they met, my dad had an apartment on the beach in Venice. For a few years, and my mom always liked Venice, and she said, you know what, you know, I'm going to pack up and leave, and she packed up everything and she left, you know. She took my brother and I and we moved to a little apartment on 23rd and Pacific, 1975, right off of Speedway, and great name for a street, Speedway. And you know, I just remember a lot of changes at that time. You know, I was just about 8 years old by that point, and all of a sudden, you know, just things got real different. You know, like I said, my mom, you know, unfortunately, my mom didn't stay sober. You know, she started hanging out in the bars. There was a couple of bars in the neighborhood back then, the Venture Inn and the Sandbar. And they were biker bars, and that's, you know, and you know, my mom had a lot of friends in those bars and made a lot of friends in those bars, and you know, my brother and I, we basically became latchkey kids, what they call the latchkey kid, you know, and you had like a shoestring on your neck, man, with a house key on it, you know, and that was it, you know, and you came in and you made yourself macaroni and cheese or toast or a bowl of cereal or, you know, or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you went back out in the street and you played with your friends, you know, and that was pretty much it, you know. My brother became a real isolator, and really obsessed with TV. All he did was watch TV and stay by himself. And me, you know, I wanted to be out. I wanted to be out in the street, you know, and you know, I'd jump on my bike, man, and I would just ride around Venice, and eventually I found some friends that, you know, they seemed like my kind of people, you know, and I found some kids in the neighborhood that were causing trouble, and I wanted to cause trouble, you know, and that's what we did. We ran around and caused trouble, you know, and we'd go into those bars, you know, and hit up those bikers. They'd be all drunk, you know, and we'd hit them up for money and stuff, you know, and they, you know, they liked kids. They knew us. We knew a lot of them, and, you know, they'd give us money, you know, and we'd go to Nick's Liquor or Muni's Liquor and, you know, and buy candy bars and soda and just run up and down the beach, you know, and ride our BMX bikes and knock over people's trash cans and, you know, just cause trouble, you know, in little ways, you know, and we were just little punks, you know, and surfing and skating and growing up down at the beach, you know, it was a lot of fun, you know. A friend of mine, Jeff, had a couple older brothers, and they grew weed and smoked weed, and that's how it kind of started out for me, you know. You know, they would always instigate us to go do stuff, you know, and so we, you know, we got into trouble with them, but we had fun, you know, and eventually we moved from one house in Venice, 23rd Pacific. We moved over to Oakwood and Marco, and that neighborhood was pretty rowdy. and had a lot of fun growing up over there. And at 9 years old, 1976, I come home from school one day, and somebody left a half a joint laying on the kitchen table, and I remember as a kid, a lot of times, I would see the adults, smoking and drinking and eating pills, and it looked like fun. It looked like fun, and going into those bars and hitting up the bikers and stuff for money. Just that smell of that stale beer. I remember as a kid that was appealing to me, and they had their motorcycles, and they had their women, and they always partied, and they always had a good time, and it looked like fun to me, and I didn't want to be a kid, I didn't want to go to school, I wanted to have a job, and I wanted to make money, and I wanted to have a car, and I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and this one day I picked up this joint and I just started smoking it, and shortly after that I come home from school and somebody left half a bottle of vodka laying out on the kitchen table, and my friend Fernando was with me, and I cracked the top on it, and I brought it back, and I just remember thinking to myself, it's real important that I get this bottle straight up and down, and I drink as much as I can, as fast as I can, and the smell and the burn did not bother me a bit, and in fact I loved it. And when I felt that burn come down and hit my stomach, I just I experienced a feeling that I never knew existed, and I brought it down and I handed it to Fernando and I said, take a hit, man, and he brought it back, and he ended up coming back down with it and spitting it all over the table, and and I was like, dude, what are you doing, and I just remember thinking to myself that drinking was an important thing, for a person to do, for a man to do, and that started it for me, about that time there was a movie that came out and it was called Star Wars, and my brother got hooked on that movie, man, and a lot of kids in the neighborhood got hooked on Star Wars. It was a big deal, and I didn't understand it. I remember my parents took us to see it, but I didn't understand it. There was some weird creatures in it and whatever. Shortly after that, there was another movie that came out, and it was called Cheech and Chong Up in Smoke. And that movie, I understood, and not only did I understand it, but I wanted to help those guys, I wanted to meet those guys, I wanted to help them, I know this is an AA meeting, and drugs is a part of my story also, to me, drugs and alcohol was like milk and cookies, it was like peanut butter and jelly, they just went together, and some people, have a hard time with the drug aspect. If I'd have known I was going to get sober, and somebody, left that joint on the table, I don't know what to say. Somebody handed me something, I was going to do it. And that's just the way it was. I became obsessed with just hanging out down at the beach with my friends and drinking and smoking and partying, and I became obsessed with when was the next time we were going to drink, when was the next time we were going to get loaded, and my mom was actually selling weed a little bit at that time, and I was pinching her an ounce a week, and I mean it took her like 5 weeks to finally catch on, and basically how I got caught was there was a girl called me up one day and she said, hey Jaimie, why don't you get some pot from your mom and come over and let's smoke out? And this chick was hot, and I'm thinking, man, and she was a couple years older than me, I'm 9 years old, she's like 11, I'm like, wow, okay, and so I went in my mom's room and I pinched some weed and I went over to Elisa's house. Turned out her mom and my mom were actually friends and had worked together, and and unfortunately my mom, our house was one of those houses where, somebody was going to stay for a little bit and then 6 months later they're still on the couch, and this lady was staying with us, man, and she burned me down, because you know, she heard this chick calling. She was the one who told me, hey, the phone's for you. And I went into, you know, it was a big house we were living in at the time, and I went into one room and I picked up the phone, and I didn't know she was listening on the other end, you know. And I came home that night, and I ran in the alley behind the house, and I hit some Visine, and I went in the house, you know, and I was like, hey, Mom, how's it going? And, you know, I think I grabbed a little snack out of the refrigerator, and I went upstairs to my room, you know. And on the way up the stairs, she goes, good, you're going to your room. That's where you're going to stay for a little while. I'll be up to talk to you, you know. And, you know, she just ended up lecturing me a little bit, and that was it, you know. My buddies and I, we started, I better speed this up a little bit. My buddies and I started skating around town and carrying a tennis ball with us, or a football, or whatever we could get our hands on. And we'd find people growing weed in their backyards, and we'd throw the ball over the fence, you know, and if a dog or nobody came out, then, you know, we'd jump over the fence and heist their plants, you know. And when I was 12 years old, I gave my mom a bong and a plant for her birthday, you know, and to me it seemed normal, it seemed acceptable, you know, and at that point she was like, okay, yeah, son, you know, I guess you're old enough to blaze now, you know, and so I started partying with my mom, and then my dad found out, and then I started partying with my dad, you know, and then we moved in this other house in Venice over by the canals, and turned out that there was a really nice French-Italian girl lived next door, and you know, she liked me a lot, and I liked her a lot. Her mom was one of the biggest drug dealers in Venice, 1980. Pink Floyd, The Wall had just come out, man, and you know, I mean, it was a big deal, man, you know, and my mom had it on 8-track in her Cougar, and you know, and my girl and my mom and I would hang out, man, and we just blaze big bud and drink, and you know, and man, it was fun. You know, we had good times. You know, her mom and my mom were good friends, and she lived right next door. You know, and at 12 years old, man, we were stealing a lot of drugs from this lady, and we were selling drugs down at the beach, and trading drugs for alcohol, and just running amok, having a good time. You know, and this young girl and I, you know, I mean, I was only 8 days older than her, but I mean, you know, at 12 years old, you know, her and I were doing stuff that, you know, I just, you know, I can't even believe it, you know, and I'll share a little bit of my sex inventory, because maybe there's some people falling asleep, and this will perk their ears up. But one of my, you know, two embarrassing situations that happened with her and I was, well, first off, the first time we went to have sex, she had hair down there and I didn't, you know. And when you're a man, you know, it's kind of an embarrassing thing, you know. So, you know, that, you know, I kind of took that hard, you know. And I guess the other thing was, you know, one day we went to, you know, we thought our mom came through the front door, and we went to throw a rubber over the back fence, and it got caught on the barbed wire, and my pants were down on my ankles, and I trying to get this rubber off the barbed wire and try to pull my pants up, but at the same time, you know. So there you go. Those are my two most embarrassing sexual moments there. But so, you know, but we were having fun, you know. We were having a really good time, and eventually her mom caught her, and you know, her mom, she got in a lot of trouble. You know, it was getting to the point where, you know, just how this disease does, you know, when we were stealing more and we were selling more, and you know, I mean, her and I were running around with, you know, a few $100s in our pocket, you know, and drugs saved up in her room, and drugs saved up in my room, you know, and there was a liquor store down the street, you know, and there was a couple people in the neighborhood that would buy for us on a regular basis, you know, or we'd trade them drugs and they'd go in the store and buy us alcohol, or, you know, and you just make it happen, you know how you make it happen, and that's what we did, you know, and you know, her and I were together for a while, and we did care about each other a lot, you know. But again, you know, it was a deep love, but it was a sick love, you know. And by the time I got into high school, for me, drinking started taking over drugs a little bit more, you know. And you know, I started hanging with older people, a lot older than me, and started hanging out with, you know, a little faster. And now, you know, we're getting into cars, and and kegger parties up at Topanga Canyon, and a friend of mine had a band at the time. A couple friends had a band, Beowulf, and they played speed metal and punk, and they were influenced by Motorhead and Suicidal, and and they were starting to play a lot of backyard gigs, and it was fun. We were having a good time. Eventually, what happened for me was the last 6 months I was drinking. That summer in between 10th and 11th grade, I was going to Venice High, and I had all D's and fails, and I had a C, and that was in PE, and that was the best I could do, and my attitude was getting worse, my drinking was progressing, and I was hanging out with people that, my mom didn't want at the house no more, and it was starting to go a different direction once I got into 11th grade. And that last 6 months I was drinking, I was in 5 alcohol-related car accidents in 6 months, and I got myself into a little bit of trouble, and was scaring my mom, and a lot of times I was starting to my blackouts were starting to last longer, and it was starting to go in a real ugly direction, and basically what happened was I ended up in a situation where I was given an ultimatum, and it was either come here and get the heat off, or keep doing what I was doing, and I was looking at more trouble, and I came here to get the heat off, and part of that was with my mom, and I came here and I quit drinking for a week, which was a big deal to me, but my pot smoking and the pills went way up, and basically what happened was I got involved with a group called the Pacific Group over in West LA, and an old neighbor of mine that I used to party with, him and his wife, it turned out he ended up getting sober, and he found out that I went to a couple of meetings, and all of a sudden he made a big deal of it. He come over to the house one night, I'm going to take you to this meeting, and it's a lot of fun, and they're a good group of people, and this and that. And this guy was a real talkative guy, one of those guys you just kind of wish he'd quiet down a little bit once in a while, and it just seemed like he talked nonstop, that whole car trip from the house to the meeting. And we went to Ohio Street that night on a Sunday night, and it was October 21st, 1983, and he says, "Oh man, you're really gonna like these people, and you're gonna like this group, And I'm thinking, dude, I'm not looking to make this a career, dude. I'm just here to get the heat off. I'm not looking to stay. Don't get all excited, And I come through the front door of that meeting, and I was basically given a sponsor that night, and he gave me his phone number, and he said, look, for the next 30 days, can you not drink or use any drugs for the next 30 days? And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And a little voice went off in the back of my head, and it said, you know what? I'll do it just to prove you wrong. Just to prove you that this isn't for me. I got other plans. When they told me that I couldn't smoke weed anymore, or that I couldn't use any drugs, and because I tried to claim sobriety because I hadn't drank, and he took that away from me, and it was right around October 20th, October 21st, somewhere in there. It was a little hazy, and I remember standing there in front of this guy Dennis, and he said, "You can't use anything." And my heart started coming through my chest, and my palms started, sweating real bad, and I got real scared, and I started thinking to myself, how do you live life with nothing? How do you, But I was gonna prove to this guy, number one, that I could do it, number two, that it doesn't work, and that, I think about that today, it doesn't even make sense, but that just goes to show you where my head was, I was 16 years old, and I was a punk, I had a peachy folder, and it said F the world on it. I didn't care about anything. I didn't care about anybody. I couldn't, when I brushed my teeth, when I did brush my teeth, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. I hated me, I hated you, I hated everything and everybody. And I remember having the thought, you know what, I didn't ask to be born, I didn't ask for this life, and why don't people just leave me alone? If people just would leave me alone, I'll be okay, And basically what happened was that next morning, he told me to call him 6:45 every morning, and for whatever reason I got up that next morning and I called him. And he said, "All right, kid, you going to stay sober today?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll stay sober today," And we got to day 30, and he said, "You going to stay sober today?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll stay sober today." And from that day 1 to day 30, something happened that I didn't plan on happening. And I was basically brought up in speaker meetings. If you're new, they didn't want to hear from you. You had nothing to say. You sat there and you kept quiet, and you listened to the people that had come in before you and done it before you, and that's what you did. And I remember sometimes thinking to myself, man, when are they going to let me share? But the weird part about it was that it was a podium, and I didn't want to get up there and share. And I remember sometimes I'd hide out, from the leader, once I got a few months, and I thought I might get called on, and I'd hide out, and then they'd call the 10-minute coffee break, and I'd be all upset because I didn't get called on, But I got to day 30 with this guy Dennis, and he was sponsoring me, and he said, "You know what, kid? What do you want to do? You want to keep going, or do you want what what you were living, how you've been living all this time, And basically what happened was I said, "You know what, Dennis? I'll keep going. I'll keep going." Because 30 days to me was, it felt like an eternity, and it was so huge, and it was such a big deal to me, and because from age 9 to age 16, I got loaded at every single opportunity, and I just I valued that 30 days so much that I didn't want to get loaded. And God, I believe, did something for me that I couldn't do for myself at that point. And all of a sudden, my mom started resenting it. And I'd come home from meetings, and my mom would be doing a bong load, or she'd leave a bottle of something on the kitchen table, or put a couple of beers in the refrigerator, and she became very bitter and very, very, very resentful at the fact that I was staying sober, and that was hard to deal with. That was really hard to deal with. By the grace of God, I have no idea where I'm at on time right now. By the grace of God, basically what happened was, next thing I knew, man, I'm up there at my home group, which is a Pacific group on Wednesday nights. There's 800 to 1,000 people there every Wednesday night. In the early 80s, it was right around 500-600 people there every Wednesday night, and I'm taking a 1-year cake, and my grades are starting to come up in school, and all of a sudden the world's starting to look different, and I'm sober, and it was a really weird thing, and I remember getting up to take that cake, and I'm getting up at a podium in front of 500 or 600 people. Now I've put Jack Daniels with crushed ice in a bong, with hash and coke and mushrooms and quaaludes and weed and smoked it all in one shot, and it felt like my head just blasted off my shoulders at like 1,000,000 miles an hour, you know. And I'm telling you, the head rush that I felt at that podium with all those people out there, I think it surpassed that very memorable bong hit, you know. And you know, it was just amazing to me, you know. I couldn't believe it, you know. And I started to feel some comfort, and I started to feel some joy, and I started to feel some happiness, you know. And you know, in Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, we do talk about our feelings here, you know. And I know this alcoholic, you know, I'm an overfeeler and an overthinker from way back, you know. And you know, and most of the alcoholics I talk to, they overthink and overfeel, you know. And you know, I mean, that's why we did what we did, you know, because we were trying to run, you know. And I suddenly started to realize that Alcoholics Anonymous does the same thing that drugs and alcohol does. It just requires work and effort and willingness and surrender. And it requires patience. You know, it doesn't work as fast. You know, that bottle can bring me relief in a matter of minutes. This thing takes work, takes effort, you know. And but it does the same thing. Alcoholics Anonymous does the same thing that alcohol does. But it's on a permanent basis. It's with physical, mental, emotional, spiritual sobriety that nobody can take away. Once you've got it, nobody can take that away from you. Once I realized that, I felt like I was on my way. And then resentments set in. And at 3 years sober, I walked out of a meeting one night, and I had a 70 El Camino out in the parking lot. And I went down to Carson and Compton, where I knew some friends of mine were going to be. And I jumped in the car, and I left. And I took a hiatus from AA for a few years, you know. And I decided I was going to do it my way, you know. And let me tell you what that brings you to. That brings you to a suicidal, homicidal depression. That's what that takes you to. And I went so far down in sobriety that I forgot who I was, where I came from, and what my purpose was. And that feeling of hopelessness and desperation set in. And I just thought, you know, I grew up kind of poor, you know, and I just thought, you know, if I made enough money and I had money in the bank and I was living in a nice house and I had a nice vehicle to drive and all those perks and benefits from a good job, that everything would be okay. And I became obsessed with making money. And I ended up landing a pretty good job, and I was doing pretty good. And I was driving the car that I wanted to drive. I was living in the area I wanted to live in. I had money in the bank, and I wanted to kill myself. You know, I was going out with a girl at the time that, you know, that I had liked for a year or two prior to going out with her, and you know, all those things were in place that I thought I wanted, that I thought were going to make life okay. And the alarm clock would go off in the morning, and the first thing I could think about was, you know what? Here's another day that I don't want. And I was starting to ask God to kill me. I wanted God to kill me. And I started going into gun shops and looking at guns. And I went to an old friend in the neighborhood, and I asked him if he would get me a gun. And he knew I was in a bad place, and he wouldn't get me a gun. And every day that alarm went off, and every day that, you know, that God was giving me, I didn't want. And I I was thinking about suicide most of my waking hours. And I was at work one day, and I got myself into some trouble at work because I wasn't in a good place, and I almost lost that job. And the phone rang one morning, and a friend of mine that I had gotten sober with was on the other end. And last time I seen him, he threw away 7 years of sobriety, and he was out drinking. And this guy, he had made it. You know, he had sobriety, he had success, he had money, he had the new place, he had the motorcycles, the new Chevy truck, the girl, the money in the bank, you know. And he called me, and he had ended up living in an old Datsun pickup truck out in the desert in Vegas. Lost it all. And he was tweaking for about 5 years. And he almost died. And it turned out he come back to the program. And he said, Jaimie, I'm going to a meeting tonight. Do you want to go with me? And I was so far disconnected that I almost forgot about AA. I believe I probably did forget about AA at that point. And I came in here 12 years sober with a chip on my shoulder, and people were coming up to me asking me if I was new, and I just wanted to hit somebody. You know, I just wanted to hit somebody. You know, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I was coming in here going to meetings. You were probably sitting on a bar stool in Victorville somewhere, sucking on a Budweiser, didn't even know which way was up. You know, and mine knew. You know, and you know, feeling like a crumb, man, feeling like a piece of garbage. You know, but don't you know who I am? You know. And just alcoholism jumping off at its worst, you know. And, you know, thank God that was in 1995. And thank God, I don't know what happened. Once again, you know, God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. And I ended up asking a guy to sponsor me. And I ended up coming back to meetings. And I got real involved again. And all of a sudden, everybody started changing their attitude around me. You know, and you know, because I was on the move, man. I was going to do a geographic and go to NorCal because it was LA's fault. There's too many people here, you know, and you know, 5 million people all of a sudden changed their attitude, you know, you know, in a few months' time, you know, and I started to get comfortable again, you know, and I started to be okay with life again, you know, and all of a sudden that morning came that the alarm went off. And I got on my knees. And I thank God for the gift and blessing of another day of life. You know, I'll end with this. You know, I got to go to Hawaii. I always wanted to go to Hawaii when I was a kid, you know, and I got to, you know, I'm into old cars and drag racing and have been for a long time, you know, and some friends of mine, we got to drag tow a couple race cars back to Florida and go racing in 2003, and that was a dream of mine, you know. I wanted to do that, you know, and we got to do it. And we went back to Orlando, Florida, and we raced in a class with 87 other cars, and we came out with first place, you know. And I got to see the countryside, you know, and we got to go drag racing in Texas and Florida and Arizona and have a lot of fun, you know. And I started to live again, you know. I started to feel appreciative of the gifts and blessings in my life again, you know. And I started getting on my knees on a regular basis again. And basically what happened was you know, I was being sponsored by a guy in Pacific Group, and his girlfriend called me up, and she says, you know, Casey's car's got a flat tire, would you, and he's out of town right now, would you be willing to come over and fix it for him? You know, his car's sitting in front of the house. And I said, yeah, I'll do that, you know. And I went over to their house, you know, and I took the tire off the car and I put it in the back of my truck. And there was a lady staying with them, this lady Midge that I knew from the early '80s in my sobriety, you know, and she was going through a tough time, you know, and I was doing okay financially at that time, you know, and she needed some things, you know, and I says, you know what, Midge, I'm going to my friend's gas station right now, and I'm gonna get the tire fixed. And across the street from the gas station is a Vaughn's, and she had a cat. She was living in her car. She wanted to get some cat food for her cat, you know, and some food for herself, you know. And so Midge and I jumped in the truck and we went to the gas station. And my friend Billy was working there, and I gave him the tire and asked him to, you know, to help me out with it, and he did. And I says, I'll be back. We're gonna go to the grocery store. And Midge and I went into the store, and I got a basket for her, and I gave it to her. And I said, you know what, Midge, get whatever you need, you know. And my neighbor lady, Abel, she was a really nice, sweet old lady. She happened to be in the store also, you know. And she was just checking out in the checkout line. And I knew she was going to need some help with her groceries. She's in her mid-80s, you know. And so I helped her out to her car, and I told Midge I'd be right back. And I walked out with Abel, and we put the groceries in the trunk of her car, and I'm putting the last bag in the back of her car. And it's not a big deal, I guess, if you've never experienced it before. But I had experienced a peace and a joy and a happiness that came over me at that point that I almost can't put into words. And I looked up at the sky, and it was a clear blue sky that day, and I said, thank you, God. And what I get to do is I get to break that cycle of insanity and madness that my parents lived in. You know, backing up a little bit, you know, I ended up making a 12-step call on my dad when I was a year sober. And my dad ended up coming into these rooms, and I'm glad to say that my dad passed away from cancer, 7 months clean and sober. And his name was Art. He was a good man. And what I realized in taking that shopping cart back to the little stall where it belongs is that it's in helping somebody else that the real joy comes in, that the real happiness comes in, that the real comfort comes in. Because this alcoholic can get caught up in my own little world, and I forget about others, and I forget about what's important. And that's why I come into these rooms, because I don't want to forget no more. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to the darkness and the dryness that I've had in sobriety, and I don't want to go back to the drink. I don't want to go back. You know, I want to keep going. You know. That day racing in Florida when we won was a happy time. Going to Hawaii was a happy time. But that day, helping my sponsor and helping Midge and helping my neighbor lady was a day that I'll never forget. I ask God to help me to be the person and the man that He wants me to be today, clean and sober. I pray that God blesses Alcoholics Anonymous. I pray that God blesses the alcoholic who's still suffering. I pray that God blesses the new person who comes into these rooms. And I hope and pray that every single person can keep the sobriety date that they have right here today. My friend Paul here is, he's 16 years sober today. Happy birthday, Paul. I hope and pray that I can stay close enough to my God that I don't forget where I came from, and that I don't forget to reach out to somebody else who might be hurting. I hope and pray that we all stay here, and that God blesses us as a fellowship, and that God blesses us as individuals. Alcoholics Anonymous represents hope. It represents rebuilding of families, rebuilding of careers, and rebuilding of lives. And that's a gift that, that for a long time I didn't feel I deserved. Today I can look myself in the mirror when I brush my teeth. We're all a part of God today. We're all children of God today. I hope and pray that we can all continue on this path. I hope and pray that we can all continue to give back to this program that's given to us. The wonderful thing about AA is that there's people in it. The terrible thing about AA is that there's people in it. And I just hope and pray that it can stay how it's been for so many years. And I hope and pray that this program continues for many, many years to come, many generations to come, to continue to heal and rebuild lives and families. If I make it to midnight, I'll be 22 years sober. And you guys just gave an applause to this program. You just gave applause to this program. Because the only thing I'm good at is screwing up. And let me tell you, if it can keep this dumbass sober for 22 years, excuse my language, it can keep anybody sober. It works so good that it'll keep you sober even if you're not doing it 100%. That's how good it works. I hope we all keep coming back. And I hope and pray for everybody good health, happiness, peace, joy, love, and prosperity with their higher power. God bless us all. Thank you for letting me share.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst and one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.